21.90, London Heathrow startup control. A177, startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. A438, startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, A035. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, A107. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, A177. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, meet 202. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, A438. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, A107. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, A177. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, A438. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, A035. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, A202. London Heathrow startup, review, A177. London Heathrow startup, review, A035. London Heathrow startup, review, A107. London Heathrow startup, review, E202. A107, Yorkshire, London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup, review, A438. A035, Yorkshire, London Heathrow startup. E202, Yorkshire, London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup, request pushback, A035. London Heathrow startup, request pushback, E202. London Heathrow startup, request pushback, A107. A438, Yorkshire, London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup, request pushback, A438. A035, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup. A107, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup. E202, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup. A438, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup. A177, Yorkshire, London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup, request pushback, A177. A177, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup. London to taxi, A177. A177, clear to taxi, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, clear to taxi, A177. A035, clear to taxi, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, clear to taxi, A035. London Heathrow ground, ready to taxi, main 202. E202, clear to taxi, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, clear to taxi, E202. A14824, ready to start up. A14426, ready to start up. 5451, ready to start up. A0923, ready to start up. A3601, ready to start up. A1727, hold position, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, hold in position, runway 727. Runway 07, hold position, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, hold in position, runway 07. London Heathrow startup, this is Mach 14A24, position 526, information Oscar, IFR to Glasgow, request startup. London Heathrow startup, this is Mach 14426, position 527, information Oscar, IFR to Edinburgh, request startup. London Heathrow startup, this is Mach 0923, position 535, information Oscar, IFR to Toronto west of Pearson Intel, request startup. Mach 107, resume taxiing, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow startup, this is 5451, position 567, information Oscar, IFR to Headlooking, request startup. London Heathrow ground, continuing taxi, Mach 107. London Heathrow startup, this is A3601, position 419, information Oscar, IFR to Athens Intel Airport on left areas by nozzle, request startup. Mach 1727, resume taxiing, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, continuing taxi, Mach 1727. 5451, startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. Mach 14A24, startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. Mach 0923, startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. A320neo, startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. Mach 14426, startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, 5451. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Mach 14A24. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Mach 0923. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, A3601. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar Quebec, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 14426, Yorkshire, London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, Mach 0923. London Heathrow startup, Mach 1484. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, taxi, runway clear ground, ready to start up, clear ground, continuing taxi, wind 202, ready to start up, 36, ready to start up, 159, ready to start up, hold position, runway clear ground, hold in position, 10, start up, this is 1940, position 519, information start up, Aerosucre 021, this is start up, 536, information start up, Aerosucre 136, position S is start up, 39, information start up, this is start up, 150, start up, position 522, information Oscar, Aerosucre, this is start up, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi, start small 1 Oscar 21, hold ground 0, runway start squawk 163, pushback taxi, start small 1 Oscar 21, hold ground 0, fly runway heading start 163, pushback and taxi, small 121, Oscar 0, fly runway heading squawk 160, pushback and taxi, small 1 ground 1 taxi, 10 start Oscar runway 19, fly runway heading squawk 160, pushback and taxi, small 1 heading squawk 160, pushback and taxi, small 1 Oscar startup. Well, information Oscar startup. This is D491. Possession startup. Information Oscar. This is Cocktail Taylor. BTS startup. 523. Information Oscar. Startup. Newcastle. Correct. Startup. 9R. Fly runway heavens. Block 163. Process back and taxi. Clearance. Call 121.90. Fly runway heavens. Block 163. Workers back and taxi. Clearance. Call 121.90. Runway starts. Block 163. Workers back and taxi. Clearance. Call 121.90. Runway starts. Block 163. Workers back and taxi. Clearance. Call 121.90. Runway starts. Block 163. Workers back and taxi. Clearance. Call 121.90. LH907. London Heathrow startup. Startup approved. Oscar correct. Runway 09R. Fly runway heavens. Block 163. Workers back and taxi. Clearance. Call 121.90. Block 1332. London Heathrow startup. Startup approved. Oscar correct. Runway 09R. Fly runway heavens. Block 163. Workers back and taxi. Clearance. Call 121.90. G381. London Heathrow startup. Startup approved. Oscar correct. Runway 09R. Fly runway heavens. Block 163. Workers back and taxi. Clearance. Call 121.90. Class 782. London Heathrow startup. Switching to 121.90. LH907. London Heathrow startup. Switching to 121.90. G381. London Heathrow startup. Switching to 121.90. Class 782. London Heathrow startup. G381. London Heathrow startup. LH907. LH907. Option. London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup. Class 782. Class 782. Option. London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup. Switching to 121.90. Block 1332. G381. Option. London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup. Block 1332. Block 1332. Option. London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup. Yes, pushback. LH907. London Heathrow startup. Yes, pushback. Class 782. London Heathrow startup. Yes, pushback. Block 1332. London Heathrow startup. Yes, pushback. G381. LH907. Pushback. London Heathrow startup. G381. Pushback. London Heathrow startup. Class 782. Pushback. London Heathrow startup. Block 1332. Pushback. London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow ground. Ready to taxi. LH907. LH907. Clear to taxi. London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground. Ready to taxi. G381. G381. Clear to taxi. London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground. Clear to taxi. G381. London Heathrow ground. Clear to taxi. LH907. London Heathrow ground. Ready to taxi. Class 782. Class 782. Clear to taxi. London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground. Clear to taxi. Class 782. London Heathrow ground. Ready to taxi. Block 1332. Block 1332. Clear to taxi. London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground. Clear to taxi. Block 1332. Block 314. Ready to start up. Call 9724. Ready to start up. Call 782. Hold position. London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground. Hold in position. Call 782. Call 782. Resume taxiing. London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground. Continuing taxi. Call 782. London Heathrow startup. This is Block 314. Position 507. Information Oscar. IFR to Paris Charles D. Gaulle. Request startup. fly runway heading squawk 163 for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90 London Heathrow startup control. Call 974, startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163 for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90 London Heathrow startup control. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163 for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90 Dock 314. London Heathrow startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163 for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90 974. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90 Dock 314. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90 974. Dock 276, hold position, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, hold in position, Dock 276. London Heathrow startup, Dock 314. London Heathrow startup, on 974. Dock 314, Roger, London Heathrow startup. On 974, Roger, London Heathrow startup. London Heathrow startup, request pushback, Dock 314. Bus 766, ready to start up. London Heathrow startup, this is Bus 766, 526, information Oscar, IFR to Oslo Garden Road, request startup. Bus 766, startup, 4, Oscar correct, runway 9R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. London Heathrow startup, approved,
300,
Oscar correct, runway 9R,
200,
fly runway heading squawk 163,
100,
for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90,
40,
Bus 766.
retard.
startup. This is Rock 263, position 513, information Oscar. IF artillery at King 11 Joel, request startup. London Heathrow startup. This is Ron 908, position 224, information Oscar. IF Archie for the name, request startup. London Heathrow startup. This is Rock 374, position 511, information Oscar. IF Archie Chewy's Blagnac, request startup. Rock 263, startup approved. Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. Rock 3724, startup approved. Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. Ron 908, startup approved. Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, London Heathrow startup control. London Heathrow startup approved. Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Rock 263. London Heathrow startup approved. Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Rock 3724. London Heathrow startup approved. Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 163, for pushback and taxi clearance call 121.90, Ron 908. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, Rock 263. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, Ron 908. London Heathrow startup, switching to 121.90, Rock 3724. London Heathrow startup, review, Ron 908. Rock 263.
400.
London Heathrow startup, Ron 908. London Heathrow startup, request pushback, Rock 3724. Rock 263, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup. 300, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup. 100, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup.
50, 40, 30, 20.
Rock 3724. London Heathrow ground, ready to taxi, on 908. On 908, clear to taxi, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, clear to taxi, clear to taxi, London Heathrow ground. London Heathrow ground, clear to taxi, Rock 374, London Heathrow ground, Rock 374, London Heathrow ground, ready to taxi, Rock 374, ready to start up. 1983, London Heathrow ground, London Heathrow ground, 1983, 2475, position descend 3000, Oscar 1, start and City South, International 1701, start up 166, start and taxi payments, call 160, 2475. End of pay startup.
200.
London Heathrow startup. This is Rock
100.
Position 509. Information Oscar. IFR
50,
to Warshaw
40,
Level
30,
Request
20.
startup. London Heathrow startup. This is A320neo, position 581. Information Oscar. IFR to Brussels Airport. Request startup. London Heathrow startup. This is A320neo. Position 581. Information Oscar. IFR to Brussels Airport. Request startup. London Heathrow startup. This is A732. Position 543. Information Oscar. IFR to startup. 452, startup approved, Oscar correct, runway 09R, fly runway heading squawk 165, British startup taxi, Oscar correct, runway 21.9 zeros heading squawk 165, British national taxi, startup soon squawk Oscar correct, 1.9 zeros fly runway heading squawk 165, British national taxi, heading squawk startup 61, British national taxi, squawk 165, London Heathrow startup. 396, pushback approved, London Heathrow startup. 732, pushback approved, London Heathrow